Send help. The words came through the radio so quietly that at first nobody in the operations room answered. It wasn't fear in the voice. It was something worse. Acceptance. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, a Navy SEAL team had stopped talking in complete sentences. The tactical display showed 6 blue markers holding position inside a narrow valley nearly 9 miles from the nearest support point. Their planned extraction route had collapsed an hour earlier after worsening weather and failed communications. No one in the command trailer said it out loud, but everyone understood what that usually meant. Lieutenant Ethan Brooks leaned over the console and adjusted his headset. "Repeat your last transmission." Static answered him. Then a second voice cut in, lower and calmer. "We're pinned. Visibility dropping. We can hold, maybe." Another burst of interference followed. The room stayed quiet. Officers moved between screens. Coordinates updated. Weather overlays shifted. Nobody spoke because everyone was doing the same math. Air support would arrive too late. Ground support was farther out. The valley walls blocked clean recon. Ethan looked toward the mission supervisor. Options? The supervisor folded his arms. Minimal. Nobody liked that word. Minimal meant possible on paper. Impossible in reality. Ethan stared at the map again. 6 operators. Limited movement. Unknown positions watching every exit. Then a technician in the corner said something unexpected. "There's one possibility." Heads turned. The technician didn't look confident. He almost sounded embarrassed to suggest it. He pulled up another screen and opened a personnel file with half the information redacted. A single line remained visible. Available, for Overwatch response. Ethan frowned. "Who is that?" The technician hesitated. "Civilian transport attached. Temporary designation." "That doesn't answer my question." The technician zoomed out. A location marker appeared nearly 5 miles east of the trapped team. Ethan blinked. "That's outside support range." "Yes, sir." "So why are we looking at it?" The technician swallowed. "Because she acknowledged the signal." Nobody spoke for a second. Ethan turned. "She." The technician nodded and replayed a clipped audio file. A short burst of static. Then one calm female voice. Just one word. "Copy." No rank. No introduction. No follow-up. Ethan waited for more. There wasn't any. "That's it?" The technician nodded again. "That's all she sent." Ethan looked around the room expecting someone else to explain. Nobody did. He opened the personnel file. Most of it remained blocked. Name, Claire Walker. Age, 31. Assignment history unavailable. Qualifications unavailable. Current status, active reserve authorization. Ethan looked up. "Who approved this?" The supervisor answered without emotion. "Someone above us." Ethan let out a breath and shook his head. Somewhere outside the trailer the wind picked up, carrying sand across the base in soft waves. The valley feed flickered. One of the blue markers moved, then stopped. Radio traffic returned. "Weak. Control," a voice said. "If anyone hears this," silence followed. Ethan pressed transmit. "Team Echo, stay with us." Nothing. Then another transmission appeared. Not from the valley. Not from command. The same female voice. "Calm. Controlled. Hold your position." Ethan straightened. "Identify yourself." A pause. Then she answered. "No need." The channel closed. The room erupted into questions. Ethan didn't join them. He stared at the map. One location marker had started moving. East Ridge. Toward the valley. Alone. Claire Walker moved without urgency, which was the first thing that would have confused anyone watching her. There was no dramatic sprint, no burst of energy, no visible pressure in her movements. She crossed the rocky slope carrying a long weatherproof case in one hand and a compact pack on her back as if she were walking toward an ordinary work assignment instead of a situation that had already been marked critical. The sky above the eastern ridge had turned dull gray. Wind moved across the stone in uneven waves, lifting dust and flattening dry brush. Claire stopped once after climbing nearly half a mile. She looked toward the valley but did not raise binoculars. She closed her eyes instead. 5 seconds. 10. Then she opened them and continued. Forward. Back at command, Lieutenant Ethan Brooks watched the location marker advance one measured line at a time. Someone behind him said, "She is moving too slowly." Another voice answered, "Maybe she knows something we do not." Ethan folded his arms and kept watching. The strange part was not the speed. It was the consistency. No hesitation. No route changes. No requests for updates. Whoever Claire Walker was, she had committed to a path the moment she accepted the call. The radio remained mostly quiet until a weak signal returned from Team Echo. "Control," one operator said through static. "We still have movement around us." Ethan immediately answered. "Support is inbound." A pause followed. Then a tired voice replied, "How many?" Ethan looked at the map again. "One marker." He hesitated before answering. "One." Silence filled the channel. Nobody questioned it. Nobody laughed. The operator simply said, "Copy." Claire reached a flat shelf of rock overlooking a long section of broken terrain. She set the weatherproof case down and opened it. Inside was equipment arranged with unusual simplicity. Nothing looked customized. Nothing looked impressive. She assembled each piece with deliberate movements and checked every latch once. Not twice. Her gloves were worn. Her sleeves carried no visible insignia. She placed a folded notebook beside her and opened it to a page filled with short handwritten numbers. Wind. Distance. Elevation. No explanations. She removed a pencil from her pocket and wrote one more line. Then she looked up. Her radio clicked. Ethan's voice came through. "Walker. Situation update available." Claire answered immediately. "Not needed." Ethan blinked. "You do not want current positions?" "No," he looked at the supervisor beside him. The supervisor gave a slight shrug. Ethan tried again. "Do you want drone support?" Claire adjusted a dial and looked across the valley. "Negative." "Visual feed?" "No." Ethan stared at the radio. "Then what exactly are you using?" There was a pause before she answered. "Time." The transmission ended. Ethan leaned back slowly. Nobody in the room spoke. The technician quietly opened Claire's personnel file again. Still. Blocked. One new line appeared at the bottom. Field access authorized. Nothing else. On the ridge, Claire remained perfectly still. Wind shifted. She waited. A cloud moved. She waited again. Far below, Team Echo held position without understanding why. One operator checked his watch. Another adjusted his radio. Then the team leader looked uphill and frowned. "Do you hear that?" Nobody answered. Because there was almost nothing to hear. Just wind. And somewhere far above them, someone breathing slowly and counting in silence. The first thing Team Echo noticed was not movement. It was absence. One moment the valley felt crowded with pressure and uncertainty. The next, something had changed in a way nobody could explain. The team leader lowered his radio and looked across the broken terrain ahead. Nothing looked different. The ridges were the same. The wind still moved through the rocks. The clouds still drifted overhead. Yet somehow the feeling of being compressed had eased. He checked his watch. 11 minutes had passed since command said support was coming. One operator quietly asked, "Did they send aircraft?" Another shook his head. "Too quiet." The team leader touched his headset. "Control, confirm support status." Lieutenant Ethan Brooks answered immediately. "Support remains active." The team leader frowned. "What does that mean?" Ethan looked toward the mission supervisor. No response came. Finally Ethan said, "You are not alone anymore." The line stayed open. Nobody explained further. On the ridge, Claire Walker remained in the exact position she had chosen earlier. She had not shifted more than an inch. Her notebook stayed open beside her. Her eyes moved slowly across the valley below. Not searching. Measuring. The wind changed direction again. She marked something with her pencil. Then she closed the notebook and set it aside. Her radio clicked. Ethan again. "Walker. Team Echo requests update." Claire answered without moving. "Tell them to stay where they are." Ethan stared at the transmitter. "That is all?" "Yes." He hesitated. "Do you need confirmation of conditions?" Claire looked toward a narrow break between two stone formations. "Already have." It. The transmission ended. Ethan sat back and rubbed his eyes. One of the analysts nearby whispered, "Who talks like that?" Nobody answered. A few seconds later another technician opened a restricted archive and searched Claire's name again. One additional record appeared before immediately locking. Training completed. No details available. Observation score, exceptional. Years inactive, unknown. Ethan stared at the screen. Inactive? The technician nodded. Looks that way. Ethan looked back to the moving marker. It had stopped completely. He could not understand why that bothered him more than if she had kept moving. Below, Team Echo remained sheltered and watched the open valley. One operator adjusted his pack and quietly said, "Something feels off." Another nodded. Like somebody turned down the noise. The team leader narrowed his eyes uphill. Then he noticed something small. Birds. A group of birds lifted from one section of stone and changed direction suddenly. Not frightened. Redirected. He stared for a second longer. Then another operator pointed. "Did you see that?" Nobody answered because nothing obvious had happened. Just another shift. Another silence. Another subtle change impossible to explain. The team leader slowly exhaled and keyed his radio. "Control." Ethan answered instantly. "Go ahead." The team leader looked at the empty ridge above them and spoke quietly. "Tell whoever you sent," he stopped and glanced upward again. "Tell her we know she is here." Far above the valley, Claire listened without expression. She reached for the notebook one more time and turned to the next blank page. Claire turned the page and wrote 3 numbers in the upper corner. 11. 7. 4. She closed the notebook and placed it beside her pack. Anyone watching would have assumed they were coordinates or range estimates. They were not. They were minutes. Estimates of how long pressure would shift across different parts of the valley if nothing unexpected happened. She lowered her head slightly and listened to the wind moving through uneven stone. The air had changed again. Somewhere below, Team Echo remained in place exactly as instructed. That alone was unusual. Operators trained at that level were not known for waiting. Waiting meant trusting information they did not have. The team leader crouched behind cover and checked his watch again. He had expected updates. Orders. Movement plans. Instead, all command had given them was one instruction and one unknown name. One operator looked uphill and quietly asked, "You think she actually sees us?" The team leader thought for a second. Then answered, "I think she saw us before we knew we needed help." Nobody responded. The words felt strange even after he said them. Back at command, Ethan Brooks stood beside the tactical display and watched every signal crossing the screen. Team Echo had not moved. Claire had not moved. Yet somehow the overall picture had started changing. He noticed small details. Fewer emergency requests. Fewer interruptions. Small adjustments in communication patterns. It felt less like somebody had arrived and more like somebody had already started reorganizing the situation without telling anyone. Ethan opened the personnel file again. Still mostly blocked. Then one older record briefly appeared before disappearing. Training Observation Summary. Candidate demonstrated uncommon environmental prediction and delayed engagement discipline. Recommendation: do not assign routine field role. Ethan read the line twice. Delayed engagement discipline. He had no idea what that meant. He looked toward the supervisor. "You know who she is?" The supervisor kept watching the map. "No," Ethan frowned. "Then why are we trusting this?" The supervisor answered without looking at him. "Because somebody trusted her before us." On the ridge, Claire adjusted one small dial and looked through her optics for the first time since arriving. Her expression did not change. She was not searching for individuals. She watched patterns. Movement. Empty spaces. Timing. Her eyes moved once to the left and stopped. She reached for the notebook and added another number. Then she quietly keyed her radio. Ethan answered immediately. Claire spoke in the same calm voice. "Tell Team Echo they will receive an opening." Ethan straightened. "When?" Claire looked toward the clouds drifting. "Over the western edge of the valley." 3 minutes. Ethan opened his mouth to ask another question but stopped. The transmission had ended. He turned and relayed the message. Team Echo received it in silence. One operator gave a short laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. "An opening?" The team leader looked uphill again. He did not smile. He simply adjusted his gear and said quietly, "Be ready." Above them, Claire rested one hand on the closed notebook and waited as the clouds continued moving exactly where she expected them to go. 3 minutes felt longer when nobody knew what they were waiting for. Team Echo stayed in position and watched the valley without moving. Nobody complained. Nobody questioned the order anymore. The team leader checked his watch once, then stopped checking entirely. Something about the voice on the radio had removed the usual urgency. Not because the situation had become easier. Because somebody somewhere sounded completely unconcerned by how difficult it was. Back at command, Ethan Brooks stood with both hands on the console. The timer on the display moved down in silent seconds. 1 minute. 40 seconds. 30. He hated waiting. Waiting usually meant losing control. Yet nothing in the room suggested panic anymore. Analysts had stopped talking over each other. Operators stopped asking for alternatives. Even the supervisor looked calmer than before. Ethan finally asked the question nobody else wanted to ask. "What if she is wrong?" The supervisor looked at the moving cloud layer on the display. "Then she is wrong." Ethan frowned. "That is it." The supervisor nodded once. People who move like that usually already accepted the cost of being wrong. Ethan turned back to the screen. On the ridge, Claire Walker remained completely still. Her equipment stayed untouched. She was not looking through optics anymore. She watched the valley directly with her own eyes. The wind slowed. Then changed. The cloud line reached the western edge exactly as she expected. Shadows moved across the broken ground below and changed the shape of the terrain for a few brief moments. Claire picked up the radio. "Control." Ethan answered instantly. "Go." Claire spoke quietly. "Tell Team Echo to move 90 yards west." Ethan blinked. "Only 90? "Yes. That is the opening." Claire looked once more toward the shifting shadows. "It is enough." Ethan transmitted the instruction. Team Echo received it. The team leader looked around at his operators. Nobody argued. They moved exactly as ordered. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just disciplined. 90 yards. When they reached the new position, something strange happened. The valley felt different. The pressure they had been experiencing all afternoon suddenly eased. Sight lines changed. Angles shifted. A narrow path that had looked exposed now felt protected by terrain and shadow. One operator looked around and quietly said, "How did we not see this?" The team leader did not answer. He was looking uphill again. His radio clicked. Ethan's voice returned. "Status?" The team leader scanned the area and slowly replied, "We have room." Back at command, nobody spoke for several seconds. The technician zoomed out the map and noticed something unexpected. Team Echo was no longer centered inside the highest pressure zone. Their new position created options. Routes. Time. Ethan stared at the display. Nothing explosive had happened. Nobody arrived in a helicopter. Nobody rushed in dramatically. One quiet adjustment had changed the entire shape of the situation. Ethan pressed transmit. Walker. Confirm next action. Claire reached for her notebook and wrote a single word across the top of the page. Momentum. Then she answered. Now they leave. Team Echo began moving within seconds. Not because they suddenly felt safe. Not because the valley had become easier. They moved because somebody had given them something more valuable than certainty. Direction. The team leader signaled and the group advanced through the narrow corridor created by terrain and shadow. Nobody rushed. Every step looked deliberate. One operator quietly said, "Feels wrong leaving this slowly." The team leader answered without turning. "Feels worse not trusting it." Behind them, the valley remained quiet in a way none of them understood. Not empty. Not harmless. Just strangely organized. Like invisible lines had been redrawn while nobody was looking. Back at command, Ethan Brooks watched the blue markers move for the first time in hours. Their pace was controlled and steady. Distance to extraction slowly decreased. He should have felt relieved. Instead he kept glancing at Claire's location. She still had not moved. The technician noticed it too. "She is staying." Ethan nodded once. The technician frowned. "Why?" Ethan looked at the screen and answered quietly. "Because she thinks the work is not done." Nobody argued. On the ridge, Claire remained seated with the notebook open. Her eyes followed Team Echo for several seconds before shifting elsewhere. Not toward them. Beyond them. She wrote another short line across the page and crossed out the previous one. Then she reached for the radio. "Control." Ethan answered immediately. "Go ahead." Claire spoke calmly. "Team Echo will stop in 120 yards. Ethan looked confused. "Stop." "Yes." "Problem?" Claire watched the changing shadows below. "No." "Opportunity." Ethan relayed the message. Team Echo received it without question now. 120 yards later the team leader raised his hand and everybody stopped. They waited. 30 seconds passed. 1 minute. Nobody spoke. Then one operator looked to the left and quietly said, "I see it." A narrow shelf hidden behind uneven stone. Not visible from their previous position. Large enough to regroup. Protected from the open valley. The team leader stared for a second before shaking his head slowly. How did she know? Nobody answered. They moved into the new position and immediately noticed the difference. Better angles. Better visibility. More options. One operator took off his headset for a second and laughed quietly. Not because it was funny. Because the feeling was unfamiliar. They had spent hours reacting. Now it felt like somebody else had started shaping the situation for them. Back at command, Ethan opened Claire's file again. Another record flashed before disappearing. Evaluation note. Candidate demonstrates advanced anticipation under environmental uncertainty. Recommendation denied. Reason classified. Ethan stared at the words. Advanced. Anticipation. He looked at the supervisor. She predicted all of this. The supervisor stayed silent for a moment. Then answered. Maybe she did not predict it. Ethan frowned. Then what? The supervisor looked at the moving map. Maybe she noticed things everybody else ignored. On the ridge, Claire finally reached forward and closed the notebook. She looked once toward the valley and keyed the radio again. Ethan answered immediately. Claire spoke in the same calm tone. Tell Team Echo they are ahead of schedule. Ethan blinked. Ahead? Claire looked toward the horizon. Yes. A pause. Then she added quietly, that means someone else will notice soon. Team Echo did not ask who would notice. Nobody needed the explanation. In places like this, momentum had a strange side effect. The moment one side regained rhythm, the other side eventually realized something had changed. The team leader listened to the radio and looked at the path ahead. Extraction was no longer impossible. It was becoming visible. That alone felt dangerous. Hope made people impatient. He turned to his team and spoke quietly. Same pace. Nobody gets excited. They nodded. Nobody argued. They moved again. Back at command, Ethan Brooks kept replaying the last transmission. Ahead of schedule. Someone else will notice soon. It sounded less like a warning and more like an observation. He opened Claire Walker's file again even though he knew most of it would remain blocked. This time the system paused longer than before. One document appeared. Archive Deployment Assessment. Location classified. Status complete. Notes available. Ethan selected it. 3 lines appeared. Candidate demonstrates unusual patience under pressure. Candidate delays action until environment reaches favorable conditions. Candidate repeatedly improves extraction outcomes without direct engagement. Ethan read the last line twice. Without direct engagement. He looked toward the supervisor. She does not force situations. The supervisor nodded once. Looks like she lets them reveal themselves. Ethan stared at the screen. He thought back to every decision Claire had made so far. She had not asked for more equipment. She had not requested support. She had not moved after reaching the ridge. She had only adjusted timing and position. Somewhere in the middle of that realization, another line appeared at the bottom of the document. Call sign history available. Ethan clicked it. One word appeared. Falcon. No explanation. No unit history. No decorations. Just the name. Ethan looked at it for several seconds. Who named somebody Falcon? The supervisor answered quietly. Usually not themselves. On the ridge, Claire watched Team Echo disappear through the route she expected them to take. She picked up her notebook and turned back through the pages. Short notes. Numbers. Weather shifts. Tiny observations. Nothing dramatic. She stopped at an older page near the middle. One sentence had been written there long ago. People rush because they think action creates control. She looked at it for a moment before closing the notebook again. Her radio clicked. Team Echo this time. The team leader spoke first. Walker. Claire answered immediately. Go ahead. There was a short pause. Then he asked, how long have you been watching? Claire looked toward the horizon. Long enough. Another pause. You knew where we should move before we did. Claire thought for a second. You knew too. The team leader frowned. Then why did we not see it? Claire answered in the same calm tone she always used. Because pressure makes people look at problems instead of space. Silence followed. One operator nearby quietly repeated the sentence to himself. The team leader pressed transmit one more time. When this is done, I want to know who you are. Claire looked down at her closed notebook. Then toward the sky. No, she said softly. You want to know why nobody told you. The channel went quiet. And for the first time all day, nobody in Team Echo had an answer. Team Echo kept moving, but something had changed. Earlier they had been moving to survive. Now they were moving to understand. Nobody said it directly, but the question had spread through the team the same way weather moved across open ground. Who was she? Not because she sounded important. Not because command treated her differently. Because nothing about her behavior matched what they expected from someone carrying responsibility for people she had never met. She never sounded urgent. She never sounded impressed with herself. She never asked for credit. She only seemed interested in time, space, and what came next. The team leader checked the route again. Extraction point remained reachable if conditions held. That phrase stayed in his head. If conditions held. He looked uphill one more time and realized he had stopped trying to imagine where Claire was sitting. Somehow he knew it would not help. Back at command, Ethan Brooks finally stepped away from the tactical screen and walked to the far side of the trailer. He opened the restricted personnel record again and searched deeper. Most files stayed locked. Then one older administrative note appeared. Deployment completion review. Candidate requested reassignment after repeated recommendation for promotion. Ethan frowned. Requested reassignment. He opened the next line. Reason submitted by candidate. Visibility changes behavior. Request approved. Ethan stared at the sentence. Visibility changes behavior. He quietly repeated it. The supervisor looked over. You found something? Ethan nodded slowly. She turned down advancement. The supervisor shrugged. Some people do. Ethan looked back at the file. Not after records like this. He opened another archive. This one stayed visible long enough for him to read one section. Observation comments. Candidate demonstrates unusual preference for anonymous outcomes. Performance decreases under recognition conditions. Ethan stopped reading and looked toward the map again. Suddenly the whole day made sense in a way he did not expect. She never wanted Team Echo to know who she was. She wanted them focused on leaving. On the ridge, Claire sat quietly and watched the changing light move across stone. She checked her watch for the first time all day. Then she began disassembling her equipment. Not quickly. Not like someone leaving in a hurry. Like someone finishing ordinary work. Her radio clicked. Team Echo again. The team leader spoke. Walker. Claire answered. Go ahead. He was quiet for a second before speaking again. We made it farther than expected. Claire looked at the horizon. Good. Another pause. You knew we would. Claire thought for a moment. No, the team leader waited. Claire continued. I knew you could. Nobody on the channel spoke. Then one operator quietly asked in the background, does she do this often? Claire heard it. She smiled slightly but did not answer. The team leader finally spoke again. You stayed out there the whole time. Claire closed the weatherproof case. That was the assignment. You never asked for recognition. Claire stood and placed the pack on her shoulder. Wind moved across the ridge. She looked once toward the valley. Then she answered. Recognition makes people remember faces. The team leader frowned. So. Claire adjusted the strap and started walking away. I would rather they remember decisions. The radio went quiet. Team Echo continued toward extraction. Back at command, Ethan watched the marker labeled Claire Walker begin moving away from the ridge. For the first time all day, nobody tried to stop her. Team Echo reached extraction just after sunset. Nobody celebrated when they crossed the final marker. Nobody shouted. The kind of relief they felt was quieter than that. One operator sat on an equipment case and stared at the ground. Another took off his headset and looked back toward the distant valley as if expecting to see somebody standing there. The team leader remained silent. A medic approached and asked if everyone was accounted for. He nodded once. Then he asked a different question. Was there any confirmation on support? The medic looked confused. Command said support was limited. The team leader looked at him for several seconds and then nodded slowly. Limited. That word felt strangely incomplete now. Back at command, people were already moving on to reports and summaries. Screens changed. Maps disappeared. New assignments replaced old ones. Ethan Brooks remained at his station. He opened Claire Walker's file one last time. Most records stayed locked. One final section became visible. Post-assignment comments. Candidate requested no commendation, no interview, and no public record release. Reason stated by candidate. The system paused before revealing the last line. If the work was done correctly, nobody should need my name. Ethan leaned back and stared at the screen. Then he closed the file. He did not print anything. He did not copy anything. Some part of him felt like doing that would miss the point. An hour later Team Echo arrived at command for debrief. Dust covered their gear and exhaustion showed in the way they moved, but their attention stayed unusually focused. The team leader walked straight to Ethan. Where is she? Ethan looked at him. Who? The team leader held his stare. Do not do that. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he looked toward the map station. Claire's marker was gone. No departure request. No escort. No follow-up. Just gone. Ethan answered honestly. I do not know. One of the operators stepped forward. You mean she left? Ethan nodded once. Nobody spoke. The team leader looked down for a second and then asked, can I at least know what she was? Ethan thought about answering with rank or assignment. Instead he turned the monitor around and showed only one thing. Call sign. Falcon. The room stayed quiet. One operator frowned. That is all. Ethan nodded. That is all I got. The team leader looked at the screen for several seconds. Then he gave a short laugh and shook his head. Makes sense. Ethan looked at him. What does? The team leader rested his hands on the table. We kept trying to figure out where she was. He looked toward the dark window. She was never the point. Nobody spoke after that. Later that evening, long after the debrief ended, Ethan stepped outside the trailer and looked east toward the ridge line. Night had covered most of the landscape. Wind moved quietly across the base. He reached into his pocket and found the note he had written earlier. Visibility changes behavior. He looked at it for a second and folded it away. Somewhere miles from the base, Claire Walker walked alone along a narrow dirt road carrying the same weatherproof case and the same pack. She stopped once and looked back toward the mountains. Not proudly. Not emotionally. Just long enough to confirm they were still there. Then she kept walking. No escort. No ceremony. No one waiting at the end of the road. The next morning Team Echo returned to training. During navigation drills one operator suggested a route. Another disagreed. The team leader looked at the terrain for a second and quietly said something nobody expected. Stop looking at the problem. They turned toward him. He adjusted his gloves and looked ahead. Look for the space. Nobody asked where he learned that. And for reasons none of them fully understood, nobody forgot it.